Hi, and welcome to our conflict roundup for February of 2024. I'm Richard Sassoon. I'm with my host, Aaron De Los Reyes, and co-host Aaron De Los Reyes, and we're going to talk about some of the larger conflicts that are going on in the world today. Um, the rules, for those of you who may not be familiar, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we are going to be discussing today. And neither is Aaron. We're just lay people who are very interested in these sorts of subjects and are really excited to talk more to you about it. This is going to be a secular presentation. We're going to try as best as we can not to take sides, although with current events, that's very difficult. Um, we like to adhere to Will Wheaton's law of be respectful. Um, yeah, but we love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time to those questions as they arise. Uh, what I like to talk about is that this presentation will have a 2 hour hard stop. So at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, that will be the end of the presentation. Any materials we don't get to, we'll address at a different point. This is a recording and you can watch it later. Uh, like all the other recordings and events in the Middle Eastern History series that I finished, this series or my upcoming East Asia series, and Aaron and I's collaboration on the European Union series, all those are recorded. You can watch them later. And you can find them on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to see all of the episodes of the various series that we put together. And if you want to be part of our Zoom group, so you can ask your questions in real time, here's the Zoom link. So that way you can find out more about our meetings and be able to participate. And if you believe that what we're doing is worthwhile, please, we appreciate any kind of money to keep the lights on. You have our links to PayPal and buy a coffee below. Okay, so since we talked about all of that last time. There's one, of course, recent event to discuss with regards to Ukraine and Russia, and that is the recent passing of Alexander Navalny. Aaron or Zach, if you want to provide some color on what recently happened to Navalny and what it spells for the development of democracy or freedom within the Russian context.
I might have a connection issue. Aaron, go ahead.
Yep,
I'll,
sure. So there's a simple upfront answer, which is that he was, in essence, denied medical treatment for really ever since both the combination of poisoning and a disease that he had, and then there's a more strategic discussion, which is that this is more Putin signaling of what he can do to anyone that challenges his authority or the overall authority of the Russian regime. And I think it's one thing to see this and talk about it strategically and sort of theoretically. It's another thing to actually see the mechanics of the power that's wielded and ultimately the reaction. Right? If you notice that either regime allies around the world or neutrals, there's absolutely no reporting. There's no conversation about it. It didn't happen. And then obviously um, in the democratic states of the world, everyone's pretty much aghast by what was ultimately uh, inevitable once he went back from Germany to Russia. And it sort of proves the point that you can't actually take anything at any level when it comes to the regime seriously when they negotiate anything. I mean, and I think that's the real risk actually in one of these events is that if Russia is trying to drive a negotiated settlement by using third parties, um, these kind of actions actually weaken it in the process because the Ukrainians or anybody else in Europe that would want to support a negotiated settlement, having these kind of actions happen just really questions the underlying validity of the approach that they take when it comes to um, to negotiating anything. So, and I mean, you could argue that, well, nobody cares. I mean, sure, nobody cares unless you're on the other side of the negotiation. So I think that's ultimately, and now if we want to talk about who he was as a figure, and maybe Richard, you can give some more color to
Yeah.
that. That could be good too, because there's a whole ecosystem generation of these people who are, have left underground, hiding, or have rebranded themselves, because obviously the cost is too high to challenge the regime.
Yeah. Um, Before we get to that, though, there were sort of two things that you talked about that I think that are really interesting to sort of bring to the fore. First is that he was caused to die, I think you could say, as opposed to the fact that he was actually directly assassinated or targeted. And to me, that's always been sort of a strange quirk of Putin's government in that they want to assassinate people. They want to make it obvious that they were responsible, but they don't want to somehow seem like it was their direct fault. They want to create some sort of like moderate ambiguity, even though there is no real ambiguity over the assassination. And I've never quite understood why that is, because if the reason that you want to assassinate somebody publicly is the demonstration of power, the reason why you want them to go quietly in the night is the idea that, you had no hand in their death. But you're doing the public action without the demonstration of power. For me, that's always been kind of strange, and perhaps one of the two of you could square that circle for me. The second one is that I really like that you bring up that it draws out Russia as an actor that with which you can't have reasonable or good faith belief that they will follow through with the negotiations that they promised, and that really does create a wrinkle if you're trying to create some sort of negotiated settlement with respect to Ukraine.
Yeah. So, did you want me to jump in on that, or did you
Yeah,
have another point? Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's always been pretty simple. These regimes, and I think when China does this too, um, the playbook is basically, um, this ambivalent. We told him not to do it, and for some reason he did it, and I don't know, bad things happen. Anderson window installations are always seeming to fail in Russia, and people fall out of windows all the time, and so there's this almost comedic discounting, which is really almost a dark, kind of comedy, which obviously given the seriousness is not, but from a Russian power and cultural standpoint, it's effective because it basically signals to any actors, look, the fate that you have is not this linear fate, 70, 80, 90 years ago, Stalin taken out back and shot. It's this more almost theater of the absurd, where you're going to get your family, everybody that supports you is going to get dragged for however many years it takes, down this horrible path, to the same result. And I do think this is the key, is that there was the old linear approach was very targeted, very almost it was almost mano a mano. The new approach drags in a whole bunch of the allied supporters, so it allows the regime. I mean, if we're going to get very street about this, to sort of punk the other states, which in this case is literally Germany, and Merkel, even though she's not in power anymore, because of her support. So, I mean, it's able to really engineer this power dimension, which going out and just conducting a linear assassination doesn't do.
Mm.
So, the ability to drag the UK in on the poisonings, the Germans in, the Poles in, I mean, literally all the European actors. What it does is it's part of this larger, gray zone set of activities, which is to signal that your regimes are impotent. in the West. We can do what we want. We have, arbitrary power. Um, and what can you do? Take us to court, sue us, try to arrest our people, and we'll just hold some of yours hostage and trade for them and make them national heroes. Whether it's Victor Blunt or whether it's the assassins in the UK, it doesn't matter. So that's a dimension that they've engineered, which I would say they're world class actors at. Iran does or tries to do similar things, and I'd say they're
Much less
50-50
successful.
on that. Yeah, yeah. But the Russians are just world class at this. And some of it, I think, comes down to this gray zone activity. They are very comfortable with full vertical escalation in gray zone activities, whereas outside actors are extremely uncomfortable with vertical escalation and gray zone activities.
I think this fits
Because,
actually yeah, I think this
yep.
actually fits very into something that you and I haven't discussed as much, but the idea that Putin has advocated in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years of Russian borderlessness, that Russia doesn't need to be constrained by a set of agreements in terms of where its borders end, and the concept of Russian empire that Putin in many ways is seeking to evoke by his power demonstrations don't have an edge. And so, therefore, these acts in the gray zone sort of question whether or not the sovereignty of other nation states that exist in the European theater, especially, um, actually exist, and whether or not they are truly just not part of Russia yet, in the way that the liberal commentary on Republican philosophy is that they're just not millionaires yet, right? They're so Putin is a temporarily dispossessed imperial presidia, right? Um, that I think that sort of fits into that idea. One of the comments, and I think it's worth reacting to, is that it might be too frightening for citizens to see a direct execution, and I don't believe that to be accurate. I don't think that the Russian population would be bothered to the point of actual political engagement by the removal of political opposition. And there's a long history of purges within Russia, a long history of strong leaders, the kind of gray type attack that we saw with Navalny's death, with the poisoning in the UK, and other similar kinds of attacks are nowhere near the level needed to really shake a lot of the Russians out of their sort of political neutrality or pro-Russian sentiment already. Um, yeah, I think that sort of covers it. In terms of Navalny's past, I think one of the things that a lot of Americans seem to not understand about Navalny, at least from my reading of it, is that he's not a Democrat small d in the sense of that he believes in some sort of multicultural, ecumenical, Western rules-based order approach to Russia, or to the degree he does, that's not the center of his emphasis. In fact, he spends a lot of time with Russian ultranationalists and has a strongly nationalistic view of Russia and Russian development. He simply disagrees with Putin on the trajectory of that and whether or not that can be accommodated with or without European nation states, and whether or not that can be accommodated with or without freedom of speech and other sorts of internal Russian benefits. So it's not entirely clear that Navalny would have been, quote, better for Russia. He might have been better for international politics, but I don't know if he'd be better for Russia. Um, just in terms of stability and holding the country together, because a lot of the pressure that Russia is facing on the one side is from the Ukraine war, but on the other side is from uh, the fact that it's a multicultural empire that's really refused to recognize its multiculturality.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. I mean, I do believe he would have been um, more effective on an economic basis because I do think Navalny was a more modern, developed individual, just
Yeah.
generationally, and 20 years uh, the junior to Putin, and I would say more exposure outside of Europe. I mean, I'm sorry, outside of Russia. So I do think there would have been more productive engagement economically,
Hmm.
which isn't. no offense to anyone that thinks Russia's doing great economically right now, it isn't a very high bar, because there's just a lot of sort of basics that Russia struggled with since the end of the Cold War, which is example being its natural resource base, while other areas of the world have achieved enormous, I mean, 5, 10, 20x gains, whether it's the Gulf, whether it's Canada, whether it's Peru, whether there's Indonesia. I mean, pretty much every resource extractor on the planet, except Russia, hasn't had a 3 to 20x gain in their modernization and their infrastructure around natural resource extraction. So I don't think that's well, obviously it's hard to do in Russia for practical reasons, environmental and logistical, but at the same time, it's something you would have to do. And I do think someone like him could could be comfortable in cutting the kind of deals, which are still nationally driven deals, right? Where it's like 2 voting stocks, the state maintains control. There's a shared economic benefit outside the state, outside of the territoriality, et cetera.
Right.
Those aren't incredibly complex Goldman Sachs financial engineering deals to do anymore, right? Those are pretty straightforward. I mean, you could just hire the people from everywhere else that have done these
I
and
mean,
do
to be
those. And
fair,
so
that is, I mean, to be fair, that is what Russia used to do, right? During
that's right.
the 2000s and the
Exactly right.
2010s, a
That's right.
lot of the major oil extraction positions, especially on the eastern side of Russia, but also on
Yep.
the western side, but especially on the eastern side, were staffed by Americans, Germans,
That's right.
and other foreign experts who pretty much all left as soon as Putin invaded Ukraine. It
That's
was
right.
um, one of
I
the,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue some of the even pre-Ukrainian invasions were already triggering some of those populations already.
Yeah,
Meaning, like in the late 2000s, which was a combination of both the financial crisis, which was a triggering event, which should have drove a different response anyways,
yeah.
to being more flexible, which in some ways Putin just went the other direction, and then the regime went in the other direction. So I mean, I think Navalny ultimately would have been, I think it's safe to say, 50% better, which isn't a high standard for Russia, and maybe there's a shot there, that he would have actually had other actors, just a new generation of more, sure, they would have all been Russian nationalists, but you know most of these autocratic states, or any kind of autocracy, the people are nationalists, and we just accept that. The question is, do they have so much nationalism that gets in the way in the modern world of being a rational global economic actor? That's really the question. And then what falls from that? Meaning, when you're a global economic actor, there are certain behaviors. I mean, you still dispose of regime challengers, but you might not do it in a Stalinistic way, right? You buy them off. They get into a random car crash every 5 or 10 years, but not every 5 to 10 weeks. It's like the math. Because the issue is that do you need more than 2 of these stories to make it clear you have regime power? Probably not. You don't need 200. You don't need 2,000. So they kind of overindulge on, like, they over rotate on proving regime power and under rotate on global economic development.
Right.
And they're actually this Ukrainian, and I think this is a thing that isn't really discussed as much anymore, is that the cost to Russia in terms of the sanctions are, now it's not just being impact felt, it's being structurally and strategically felt, meaning partnerships and investments are just gone now. They just don't exist anymore. Right.
And
And
also the
so
capital to be able to fund
that's
anything
right.
is just gone.
That's right. It's gone. And everybody talks about this sort of, and I want to emphasize sort of BS around sort of magical, realism around BRICS thinking. right? There's no BRICS currency. There's not going to be BRICS bonds. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Like literally doesn't make sense, right? If Europeans can't share debt, and they share about as much as you can without actually being a federated state, maybe in history, um, you're not going to get a whole bunch of separate autocratic regimes sharing debt to generate bonds. And if you can't generate the bond, well, you can't generate the
What are you
interest rate.
investing in? Yeah.
Yeah, you can't generate the currency, right? The whole show. So everybody who thinks there's going to be this brickification, um, that to me is more of a club that everyone's going to join versus an actual economic system.
I also
Because
don't,
no, go ahead.
yeah, I also don't see political alignment between India and the other BRICS members,
Of
right?
course not.
Like I see South Africa with practically no weight being very interested in an alliance with Russia. I see China as wanting to be the larger partner in that relationship, but the Chinese currency is strictly controlled, and so there's no way it could become a global currency. Um, sorry. Brazil is collapsing faster than a flan, so I don't know what they could contribute to anything. And they're also very strongly in the North American sphere, even though they're in South America. So like it just to me it's this idea of maybe the third world will rise again. And to the extent that there is political animosity towards the West, together, yes, they can cause enough problems for the West to be overexerted, but I can't see them actually generating any sort of center or any sort of new system that they can only tear down the old system. All right. So moving on from this, we move into the Sudanese Civil War. So the Sudanese Civil War is not getting a lot of press in the United States, primarily because most Americans can't find Sudan on a map, and they think that Africa is one country. But moving on from that sort of basis, we should talk a little bit about what Sudan is and why it's in the state that it is. So, if we go back to the Middle Eastern history series that I put together, we understand that Sudan is actually an Egyptian colony, an Egyptian territorial expansion in the mid 1800s. Egypt was a modernizing state that was cut short by um, British and French actions and the financial overexertion of Khedive Ismail in his attempts to conquer Ethiopia as part of his larger empire. So those things together made Egypt uh, part of the larger British Empire. But prior to that, for nearly 70 years, Sudan had in one way or another been an Egyptian colony, and not just an Egyptian colony, but an Egyptian source of slave labor. And this created within Sudan um, a racialized caste system that still really exists today, even if it isn't legally ingrained. On the top, you have people who are relatively lighter skinned. Now, of course, as you can see from the picture of the various ethnicities of Sudan, almost everybody who is Sudanese today would be considered under a European or an American lens to be black. But the term black in Sudan generally refers to people of an even darker complexion, right? So people like Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who you can see on the left-hand side of that picture, he would be considered non-black in a Sudanese context. So we need to sort of understand that. And it was the non-blacks or the Arabs, again, with this very darkened coloration, who were the leaders of the slave trade. Then you had black Muslims, and then you had black non-Muslims. And so you had this tier system of segregation and organization within the country. So understanding that, even with Sudanese separation from Egypt in 1956 and uh, the development of a Sudanese government, the power in Sudan was almost always held by the Arab Sudanese, the lighter skinned of the Sudanese. And this has created a climate that resulted in a number of attacks against non-Arab Sudanese. Probably the most famous of these in the early 2000s was the Darfur genocide, which targeted uh, what's considered a black Muslim population, the Darfuris, in the westernmost part of the country of Sudan. Um, so, because of this and numerous other political issues, such as falling economy, standards and issue, failure of life to improve, constant civil war, especially with South Sudan, which became independent in 2011, there were increasing calls for Omar Bashir, especially in 2019. Sorry, yeah, sorry, 2019 and 2020, to vacate the government. So Omar Bashir was overthrown by the military in coordination with these protests as a result of these protests. And the military sort of broke down into two different pieces. One was led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, which is the Sudanese army itself, and the other one is led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or also known as Hemedti. And Hemedti leads what is called the RSF. And the RSF is a force that is combined partially of Sudanese, but partially also of mercenaries from other African countries, especially Eritreans, and are supported by the Wagner Group, which is a Russian paramilitary organization. We've seen the Wagner Group, for example, under its former leader Prigozhin in the Ukraine situation, but Wagner is much more prolific throughout Africa in terms of its effect. So you then have, between 2020 and 2022, a power struggle between the civilians who have come into power on the backs of these generals and their militaries and the generals themselves. And the generals felt that they weren't given enough power and enough respect by the civilian apparatus. The civilian apparatus felt that the generals were preventing a true democracy from rising. So in 2022, Al Burhan and Hamidti aligned with each other to remove the civilian authorities, or rather to make the civilian authorities subservient to them. But the two of them couldn't agree on how to run the government. So now you ended up with a civil war between Burhan and Hemedti and their respective militaries in Sudan. The civilian government during this phase where the two military leaders are opposing each other, the civilian government tended to align more with Al Burhan and Al Burhan with them. And so they began to be empowered. However, because of the Wagner connection that Hemedti maintained, he was able to be more militarily viable. And starting from his position in what is southern Darfur, you can see sort of the map where that red center is where his power base was, and he was able to spread through most of central Sudan and put both Khartoum and Omdurman, the two major cities. They're sort of like Minneapolis and St. Paul, like they're two brother cities like that across the sides of the river. Khartoum and Omdurman are both under uh, the quasi control or most control of the RSF, which is Hamedti's force. And this has created an incredible amount of fear and violence within the city of Khartoum, um, mostly manifest in attacks against civilians, uh, forcible uh, sexual uh, acts, and large scale destruction of property throughout the area. You also have massacres that are occurring in the Darfur region. As I mentioned, Hemedti's primary base of operations is in the Darfur region, but his primary constituency are either foreign, right, because he employs a lot of mercenaries and therefore they don't have any connection to local people, or they're Arab Sudanese, these lighter skinned Sudanese. And so we're beginning to see large scale massacres throughout the Darfur region again against the Darfuri population who are seen as black Muslims as opposed to Arab Muslims. Probably the biggest set of massacres is the massacres around Masalit, where thousands of people have already died and thousands of people are, their whereabouts are unknown. the Sudanese conflict, in terms of its scale, is quickly rising, um, and becoming more and more dangerous as time moves forward. The Burhan government, which is the one that's recognized internationally, is now actually based on the Sudanese coast sorry, at Port Sudan, along the Red Sea, in order to get it as far away from the fighting as possible. However, it doesn't seem likely that Al Burhan is going to be able to consolidate control in the near future. You can also see the areas in yellow on the map, which are a different rebel army that has, generally speaking, been aligned with Hemedti. And so the areas along the border with South Sudan are nearly completely controlled by forces loyal to Hemedti, meaning that the South Sudanese, if they wanted to, couldn't intervene in this war. Um, Aaron, Zach, do you have any comments?
I mean, I think you did a great job in sort of framing the whole history of the conflict. This is, one of those almost permanent fragmentations that I don't see. I mean, obviously, the African Union and um, the UN have been trying to mitigate the parties by first keeping them apart. The challenge is that the Sudanese civil war is really a proxy war, which maybe we could focus a little more on in terms of surrounding states. Because I think what could be helpful is if we talk a little bit about who's to the north, the southeast, and to the west, because all those states have a interest, not just in the short term, refugees, migration, et cetera, but long term, from an ethno-religious perspective, where you have really, I would argue this region doesn't get sort of the focus as it should, because we tend to talk about the Middle East in the same way. But in the end, the same sort of post-colonial challenges of artificial constructed states is really the same problem that you have here. And in some ways it's just a much more gargantuan Lebanon. Um, and the difference is it has really, really strong actors to the point that they could pull the state apart, the post-colonial state apart, which is a pretty hard thing to do, right? In the last 30 years, there's been very few new states constructed. So the idea that a South Sudan could actually stand itself up is actually quite remarkable, because you're fighting the will of everyone in the world who does not want a Basque region in their backyard to fragment off. And so it just tells you the physics involved, right? The millions, the tens of millions of people we're talking about, which are so massive. And I would say really nobody knows what to do about this, because nobody can really impact the physics, because the proxy actors really, whether it's Ethiopia, Egypt, Congo, just nobody wants to give an inch, Eritrea, you name it, and they won't, because it's three-dimensional chess with each other. And so in some ways, Sudan becomes the casualty to that proxification. And I really don't see, it's like the Civil War is it's like harmonics, right? It just comes and goes in waves. It's never put to bed. It's never shut down. And I don't see a resolution here at a practical level. It just doesn't, like, the actors aren't, for an actor to impose themselves would be so massive of an effort that it doesn't add up. And I would say Russia's been, which I find one of the weirder things ever, is that most people don't know there's a rebranding of Wagner in Africa using the exact same anglicized spelling as the German Afrika Korps. So literally, they're called the Afrika Korps, just like Rommel's Afrika Korps. And so that's what the Wagner 2.0 is now in Africa. And they have signed up a lot of customers. I
Yeah.
think it's going to be almost impossible to stop them.
I think there's also no will from the West to stop them. No interest. I mean, China has very little extraterritorial military footprint. Um, it's growing, but it's nothing where they actually care about a conflict like this. Um, so Wagner pretty much has free reign, or the Afrika Korps has free reign uh, in this part of the world. I would further, sort of point out that this is one of those few cases where the borders of Sudan are more or less not European designed, although they are colonial designed, right? Because a lot of people seem to think that those two things are the same, but they're not, because this was an Egyptian colony um, when Egypt was an ascendant military power. And this is similar to how Korea was a Japanese colony, or how uh, you have the situation with Ethiopia and Eritrea. The fact that you have a state outside of the West creating colonies is somehow confusing to a lot of people, but this is exactly what Sudan was. And in fact, if anything, the British colonization tried to create a Sudanese identity where what had existed under the Egyptians was a very hierarchical system. Um, and we're seeing sort of the results of that racism play out on this canvas, really. The amount of people who have fled, and I think that that's a great point that you brought up, Aaron, is in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, which is an incredibly destabilizing force to a number of the countries in the surrounding area, most of whom are not terribly stable to begin with. You have the point of Ethiopia promoting certain actors in this war, and Ethiopia, as we're going to talk about, is very unstable, especially in its northernmost areas, which are the ones that border Sudan. And so the exchange of refugees between the country has been immensely destabilizing for both. Eritrea and Sudan also have a quasi exchange, you could say, of refugees because Eritrea drafts every male over the age of 13. So there's not a real good reason for Sudanese to flee to Eritrea, but sometimes it's better than what they would have had in Sudan. So you have this sort of flow. Egypt is increasingly becoming a police state, even more than it was. Chad has sort of a strange succession crisis, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But of course, refugees coming from Darfur into Chad could destabilize the country. So you have this serious possibility of the Sudanese conflict causing large-scale issues throughout northeastern Africa. Questions, comments, clarifications before we move on?
Uh, Richard, you brought a good point. Just a little bit of elaboration on that. When you mentioned, I know it's probably off topic, of Egypt becoming a police state. Um, Particularly the Palestinian refugees and then becoming a police state. Is that why they're blocking the passage from Gaza to Egypt? For that particular reason, they don't want a renewal of Muslim Brotherhood revolts, and I guess I'll cease.
There are a few reasons why Egypt maintains the blockade with Gaza, even despite the humanitarian crisis that is occurring in Gaza. Um, the first thing is that the smuggling routes and the goods routes into Gaza from Egypt have been immensely destabilizing to Egyptian control of the Sinai. And the Egyptian government cares much more about Egyptian territorial integrity and function than it does the citizens of other countries. That's the first one. The second one is, as you point out, Hamas is the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an organization that has been thoroughly antithetical to the military or military-esque governing authority of Egypt since the 1960s. That's been more or less unabated. That didn't change when Mohammed Morsi became part of the government, and then lost that power a year later. So there's that fear as well. There's also the fact that Palestinians don't want to be resettled in Egypt. They feel like that might vitiate their claims to return to their historic villages, the ones that they, their parents, their grandparents, and so on, um, were expelled from, depending on the generation of the person you're talking to. So Egypt doesn't want to forcibly make them settle. They don't want to seem to be betraying the Arab cause. And so maintaining a strong border effectively does that. Another thing is that Egypt has a massive overpopulation issue anyway. I think most recently the Egyptian population is 105 to 110 million people. There haven't been really great censuses lately, so it's hard to tell. But understand that Egypt's population in 1900 was under 10 million people. The rate of population growth in that country has been astronomical. For comparison, right, in that Egypt's population has multiplied by a 10x or 11x factor in the course of 120 years, the American population has risen from about 240 million in 1900 to around 320, 340 million today. So that's less than a 60% increase. And the United States is a hugely expanding country. So for the United States to have been in the same sort of boat, we would have had to have around 2.5 billion people um, to see that kind of level of demographic expansion. Egypt just simply can't feed that many people. And that problem is exacerbated by the fact that the way that Egypt has historically fed its people is through massive grain imports from Ukraine and Russia, two countries that are sending significantly less grain because of something going on between their border. So, um, so there are a variety of reasons why Egypt keeps the border closed with Gaza, um, and practically none of it has to do with Sudanese. To the extent that Egypt maintains a closed border to the Sudanese migrants, it's to prevent the Sudanese from creating instability in Egypt. In fact, it's been Egyptian policy to shoot Sudanese migrants on sight for the last 40 years, more or less. Um, and most Sudanese actually fled through Egypt to get to Israel because Israelis wouldn't shoot them on sight. So despite all the racial tension that exists in Israel with regards to Sudanese and Eritrean migrants, they kept coming to Israel because at least in Israel they wouldn't be shot. So that's Egyptian border security in a nutshell. Does that help? I'll take that as a yes.
Sorry,
All
Richard.
right,
Richard. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you for the clarification.
no worries. All right. So talking about the Chadian government, I think is actually a really great place to jump off for when we talk about the West African realignment. And Wagner is also present here too. So, um, under the constitution of Chad, when a leader dies, there's supposed to be an election for the subsequent leader, or the vice president is supposed to take control. There's several different provisions. Regardless of that, the what happened when Idris Deby, who'd been president, and we should use that word in quotes, right, because this is not a true democracy, um, when he died in 2021, and you can see Emmanuel Macron, the French prime minister, coming to the funeral, French president, sorry, coming to the funeral. His son was instated as the new president in order to keep Déby's alignment with France and with the West intact, and in order to prevent a military coup or some other sort of development. And that sort of sets the stage for a lot of what happened in the rest of West Africa, because historically these were all, with the exception of uh, Guinea-Bissau, which is the purple one on this map, all of these were former French colonies. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, um, and Gabon were all French colonies in Africa. And one of the ways that France continued to maintain relationships with its former colonies in Africa was through military exchanges and military force. And a lot of that was conditioned on the presence of numerous different terrorist organizations, especially jihadist terrorist organizations, throughout the region. Most famously, for example, in 2012, in the northern part of Mali, you had the Azawad Rebellion, which was an Amazigh slash um, jihadist uh, revival. The main organization that did that was Ansar ad-Din, which was a jihadist organization, an offshoot of Al Qaeda. And you have these groups throughout the Sahel, which is that region that separates the Sahara from the tropical rainforests and savanna of Central Africa. And these groups are more than capable of overwhelming and overtaxing the domestic militaries of these various countries, but a Western country can provide serious assistance. And that's what the French did in the case of Mali, helping to put down the Azawad rebellion. And throughout the 2000s and 2010s and beginning of the 2020s, you had continued French incursions into these territories, often with the permission of their Western aligned leaders, uh, to help deal with this threat, at least on paper, and secondarily to secure the long-term longevity of these countries, which were run by cliques uh, or by presidents in quotes who were largely um, either disliked or inoperative in significant parts of the country. So, starting in 2021, we begin to see coup attempts and coups successfully occurring throughout the region. Mali had two coups, the final one being in May of 2021, which was successful and put the military in power. Burkina Faso had a successful one in September of 2022 with the same result. In July of 2023, Niger was the third country to have a successful coup. And those three countries together decided that they were going to form an ever closer union in opposition to Western, especially French, neo-colonial involvement. There hasn't been that much in the way of violence following these coups. Most of them were relatively bloodless, if not entirely bloodless, but it has completely reoriented West Africa away from a at least positively uh, pro-Western sphere into one that's more anti-Western, certainly more pro-Russian. And it's also done a great amount of harm to the economic unity within Africa. There are a number of organizations like ECOWAS, right, the Economic uh, Organization of West African States, and that organization was primarily based on the idea that they would share a common currency, they would share a common um, general organization, they would be able to travel to each other's countries and promote economic development. And a lot of that has been thrown into chaos because not all of the ECOWAS members share this same ideological turn. Probably the most powerful of the ECOWAS members that hasn't is Nigeria, and Nigeria has threatened on several occasions to invade Niger and restore the president back to power and away from the military. So far, no military movements have been made by the Nigerian government in terms of physically changing the locations of troops or moving parties closer to the border. But the threat remains that, especially since Nigeria is a much larger country in terms of population, economy, resources than Niger is, um, that Niger could be overrun. One of the interesting foreign diplomatic angles of this is that while the French have been thoroughly excluded from these post-coup West African states, the United States has not been. And the United States has been more willing to negotiate with these military dictatorships than one might expect. Um, and there are a variety of reasons for this, primarily to contain Russian influence and also to contain Islamist influence, which are two political interests that the United States has in the region. Now, I didn't mention the coup en Gabon, which you can see um, located there, because the coup en Gabon is actually, it occurred in the same period, but the primary issue is that the president had been in power for something like 35 years and it didn't seem like the situation was going to improve. So the military is deciding to reallocate power, and it's a fundamentally different issue than what's going on in the rest of West Africa. Um, Guinea has had a military coup as well, and it seems to be in the broader trend of what we saw in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, but it doesn't seem to be as interested in this new post-Western alignment. We haven't seen significant moves by Guinea to reorient its political structure. Aaron, comments, concerns?
So I do think we have a different alignment when it comes to all the West African coups. So some of that has to do with history, both on the U.S. side, but also like a long-term history going back to you know uh, early U.S. and sort of post-slavery America, but also in the post-Cold War and era, we engaged West Africa or West African states quite a bit more, and there's significant sort of cultural ties also, whether it's music industry, whether it's even technology in the last 10, 15 years. Companies like Microsoft and Google and so on, Amazon have tie-ups there. So and then obviously there's the sort of post 9/11 connection, because you had various Al Qaeda factions and eventually ISIS factions, or offshoots, I guess is the vernacular, that were developed there. So there is a lot more intertwined history in West Africa, which I think tends to lend a better engagement model for both them and I'd say for the U.S. And I do think one aspect of that is um, that both during the Cold War and after, I think West African states, some did a pretty effective job in balancing between various states, whether European ex-colonial states, non-colonial European states, U.S., Russia, and then later China, et cetera, Cuba even. So they have a lot of practice in this, which I think is actually important, and when it comes to things this complicated. So I do think there is a greater chance, and to be honest, and West Africa tends to have more economic development. Some of that is just geography in terms of logistics, how close it is, both from the Atlantic side for transshipping and also to Europe. So I just think there's a higher likelihood that um, that the West African states sort of grind their way through these challenges a lot more than in East Africa. Um, and they also have there's a dimension here. They've just always been a lot more entrepreneurial and had less centralized power in their states, so more diffusive, and a lot of that just comes down to their tribal history, where trying to impose a central state just never made sense, right? They could never do the Afghan, Loya Yorga, where they get everybody together in some type of confederation to be very effective. Even Nigeria has always struggled with that, and they're probably the strongest state. I mean, actually, they are the strongest state in that whole region. Um, so I do think that realignment, and we can't forget Nigeria as a dominant actor, because they are the powerful actor in that whole region, far more powerful than France is, or was, and I would say even the EU, because you know, given how fast and massive Nigeria has become as a state, I think most people don't realize that in the next 40 years, Indonesia and Nigeria are fairly likely to pass the United States in population terms, over 400 million each. So, Nigeria is becoming well, I would say they already are a regional power, and they are on their way to becoming a regional superpower. And you know, the BRICS definition won't make a lot of sense without Nigeria in it, and I don't think Nigeria is going to join the BRICS anytime soon, given the relationship between Nigeria and South Africa, which obviously is quite challenging. So,
Now,
Richard,
oh, go
I
ahead.
have two comments or observations or maybe an explanation. So, what happened to group that's called Boko Haram or Haram? Maybe I'm not pronouncing it correctly. That used
Boko
to
Haram
kidnap.
still exists. They're in northern Nigeria.
So, how does the Nigeria being, as Aaron has stated, such an successful economic state, so to speak, and there's still this skirmishes, so to speak, or Boko Haram, harassing, kidnapping kids, and it's still going on. And Nigeria is very strong economically, and why can't they prevent these events? So first, second of all, why is this happening? Basically, in a very
yeah.
successful country. And then the second question is as also back to Aaron's question. He was talking about the state was established, Liberia. What's happening with Liberia as a state, and particularly me and Aaron are interested because the president of the state used to be a number one European football player, there, and I'm really particularly interested.
And his son, and his son actually is a starting striker for the United States
Correct.
men's team, actually. So, just as a sidebar.
Yeah. So I just wanted to know those 2 points, if you can elaborate on those 2 points. Sorry.
Sure. Let me address the first one first. One of the things that's sort of counterintuitive to a lot of people is that control over the entirety of a country's territory is not necessarily a prerequisite for functional economies in the areas under control. So you have a situation in a large number of post-colonial states, especially in Africa, where you don't have effective roads, you don't have effective rivers, you don't have effective coastline. In fact, Africa has less coastline than Europe does, despite Africa being significantly larger than Europe, multiple times the size of Europe. But the coastline is just not very indented, whereas Europe has every single fjord and peninsula you could imagine bolted onto the continent of Eurasia. So you have a situation in most African countries, Nigeria is no exception, where the rivers provide a certain degree of navigability and a certain amount of communicativity across the country. And the highways that do exist function to connect, for example, Abuja and Lagos, right? Abuja being the capital, Lagos being the largest city. You have large scale oil development, especially in the southeast, the Biafra, quote, area dominated by the Igbo minority. Um, and you have a lot of these powerful centers, and within those powerful centers, you can almost imagine it like a concentric circle dartboard, where the closer you are to that center, the more effective the police structure is. The further out you go, the less effective it is until you get to a point where it may as well not be there. So that's the way that Nigeria functions on a domestic level. And so you have, let's say, 20 to 30% of the physical territory of the country, which the Nigerian government doesn't effectively control. That doesn't mean that the other 70% of the country, where there is effective control or mostly effective control, that the economic engine of the country isn't running. And in fact, there's strong connectivity between that remaining 70%. So Boko Haram, to the extent it exists, is existing in that, let's say, 20 to 30% that's not controlled. The other issue is that porosity of the borders is relatively high in African states. So it may be the case that that Boko Haram will cross the border into Chad or they'll cross the border into Cameroon. Also, areas that those countries have difficulty controlling for exactly the same reasons. Um, and so the Nigerian military can't pursue them there because that would be an act of war. So you have this complication as well. So that allows you to have a powerful economy because the areas where you have economic productivity are physically protected, and still have areas that are under militant control. The second question was the history of Liberia. So Liberia was an African American colony in Africa. So we start seeing this movement in the 1810s and 1820s of African Americans who became free within the US context, quote, returning to Africa, end quote. And I put that in quotes because, of course, these African Americans had never seen Africa, neither had their parents, neither had anybody in living memory. These people had all been enslaved centuries prior, a century prior. So, to the extent that they were returning to Africa, they had no idea where in Africa their families came. And they had no idea what an African economy looked like. So when they arrived in Nigeria, they basically created an antebellum South economy. Just it happened to be black on black discrimination as opposed to white on black discrimination. You had large scale plantations where the indigenous Africans of the various tribes were put to work. You had wealth concentration at a very high rate, similar to antebellum South, in the hands of African Americans. And in fact, African Americans held the presidency of Liberia until the 1990s. So over 150 years of, if we want to call it, African American colonialism. Um, the trouble with the term, right, is that there was no colony to which the African American, no metropole to which the African Americans were somehow loyal. But in the same way that perhaps we could say that Israel is both an indigenous revival and settler colonial, Liberia was an indigenous revival in a certain way, right? Africans were returning to Africa, and a settler colonial environment in that they were creating a colony based on settlements.
Yeah,
Um,
and I would make a great. You brought up a great point in that there's almost a 19th century essentialism, especially racial, religious, ethnic essentialism that became really very tied into the concept of Liberian identity, and within a minority of African Americans, that identity also, which doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, you don't see a black nationalist movement in the United States anymore talking about Liberia. That was something in the 60s and 70s and sort of died out by the 1980s. And which timed perfectly with the end of, as you would point out, sort of African American rule of Liberia, very much like the Israeli project, right? I mean,
yeah.
Who's the first indigenous Israeli, right? That's prime minister, and that's a part of the or that's core to the modern government, right? Like there's almost a similar dynamic there.
I think a lot of Israelis would have a serious issue with an Arab Muslim Israeli prime minister. That said,
Sure.
no, that said, there actually, I think it was back in 2007 or six, there was an interim period where Ehud Olmert was sick. And so the
Yep.
acting prime minister at the time was actually a Druze Israeli named Majali. Um, so I think he was in power for like a few weeks as acting prime
Yeah.
minister. So Israel has had non-Jewish prime ministers,
Sure.
um, but
Well, so what I'm making a distinction here is not just that, but like where were they born? Where was their origin, right? I mean,
sure.
obviously, when you look at the founding fathers, mothers, right? There's a movie about her that just came out. It's pretty good, actually. Um, it's they were not native. They were not native Palestine or the protectorate or modern Israeli. And that's really, and I would say Liberia has that same experience. It just doesn't get the media play, right? That story isn't told. Um, so yeah, I mean, not to keep going down that rabbit hole, and
That
and
rabbit
to the
hole.
point that the present leader is really a European football superstar who spent the majority of his life living, after 16, 17, 18 in Europe, playing football and coaching and so on. So really it's almost like in the United States or in other countries,
Kobe Bryant were to become president.
yeah, or exactly, even though he was born in Italy. and also this idea of I kind of go home and do a job before I run for political office, right? You'll see that by business leaders attempting to do that, or by people who work in the national government who then go home for 2 to 4 years before they run for governor or senator, and that's a similar model. To the point that his son, is an American. I mean, born, raised here, plays for the U.S. national team, and plays in the highest division in English football. So, yeah,
Aaron,
they're
Aaron,
yeah,
Aaron, can I just add to it? You're
sure.
right. His son, I think he only rarely have seen him growing up, right? Maybe I'm wrong, but I think he was an absentee dad. So it was
Yeah,
it
but
was
that's
almost
not
yeah,
that novel.
yeah,
That's not that
yeah.
novel for
Right, right.
superstar personalities, right? Elon Musk is an absentee dad. Steve Jobs is. I mean, I think there's a pretty poor standard in highly successful males, who are absentee dads, and I think George Way is maintaining that. Um, I mean, he's not so absentee that his son isn't a great football, player. So at the end of the day, he did have influence there. But so anyways, yeah, I mean, we kind of took the turn with Liberia,
Yeah,
but back to the Nigerian point, which I think is really critical here, is that you know Lagos right now is without a doubt the most dynamic city in all of Africa, and I would say probably the whole MENA region, like objectively. I mean, I think Dubai is probably competing for it. But it's a little different. Dubai is more like Singapore when it comes to that. But Lagos is this incredibly dynamic. When you look at across the Middle East and North Africa, the 5,000 fastest growing startups. Well over a fifth of them are in Lagos. I mean, so it's become a startup superpower, right? And it's a very, very dynamic area in terms of economic development, technology, medical. All of I mean, enormous amount of the advanced medical research that's done in Africa and is done out of the main state universities in the Greater Lagos area. So it's I mean, like I said, Nigeria is going to be a regional economic superpower over the next 20 to 30 years,
I
just
was
on
going to
the
say one.
scale. Yeah. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I was going to say to add to that, um, a lot of the banking and telecommunications technologies that are being developed in Nigeria and other parts of Africa are actually more advanced than the banking and telecommunications technologies that exist in the United States.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. It's not even
so,
close. It's not even
such as
close.
paying for things by cell phone,
That's
being
right.
able to send cash transfers, being able to make local investments, microfinancing and loans. A lot of these technologies either don't exist in the United States, or to the extent that they do exist, require much more formalized structures. The
That's
same
right.
with cell phones and cell phone communications. There's a lot of use of satellites as opposed to cell towers, um,
That's right.
which doesn't have the same infrastructure requirements, but actually gets you a lot more coverage in terms of territory. So you have a lot of advances in these areas that are eclipsing Western developments in the same. So the idea of Africa like receiving Western hand-me-downs is something that is of a bygone era.
Yeah,
One question I
exactly.
had for
And
you, Aaron, before we move on,
yep.
is why is Russia so interested in this part of Africa? Are there resources? Are there is it just a vain power project? What's sort of motivating Wagner to really
Yeah.
enter here? And before I switch it over to you, I just wanted to point out there was a comment that's questioning whether or not a successful male who fathers children but doesn't actually serve as a parent to them can actually be called a dad, which I think uh, which I
Well,
think
it's
is
a
well
legal
taken.
definition, a moral definition, and a social definition, and all three of those could be totally different. That would be
I think
my
that
simple answer.
yeah,
Um,
the legal definition is biological parent, right?
exactly,
Whatever.
exactly.
So
The
anyway, Russia
but
and Wagner.
but yeah. So I mean, the thing we should not forget is how important Africa was in the Cold War as a Soviet proxy sphere, and to take it to even a greater extreme, their ultimate super proxy, Cuba, which most people don't realize participated in
The
the
Angola Civil
67
War.
and 73 invasion of Israel. Actually, they had several battalions and actually a whole regiment. So Cuba, was we're sort of Soviet shock troops. I mean, not that directly. They had their own policy at the same time that could be in conflict, but especially back then under Brezhnev, it really wasn't in the 60s and 70s, which is really the height of it. The other piece is that the Soviet intelligence network, all the stuff that everyone complains about today, the gray war, hybrid wars, blah, 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 all that was developed during, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And all those leaders were developed very much like the Soviets developed leaders all over the world from the 20s through the 50s, really, as an ideological project. And then they shifted more to an educational project. So the amount of Africans that gained education in the Soviet Union was in the millions. I mean, so it was so that tie-in, and at a certain level that sort of waned during the 90s when Russia, sort of fell on hard times and really had a lot of challenges politically, but it fired back up in the 2000s, and then I'd say in the last 10, 13, 14 years, it's not quite back to what it was at peak Soviet time, but I'd say it's probably halfway, and I think the goal is to bring it all the way back, which is going to give, and we can't forget why this was important, right? This was important because of the UN General Assembly voting positions, and so as African states, this is why the Soviets and ultimately the Chinese voted for independence movements where they would naturally not vote for those because they were very solid votes in support of various gray zone activities politically that the Soviets and later the Chinese have wanted to rub the eye in, whether it's Western hypocrisy or duplicity, which tends to be effective enough just by being hypocritical or duplicitous, but having those extra 50 votes or 40 votes has made a difference. And the US and I'd say the European Union have done a fairly effective job in maybe not swinging those votes, but to shift a chunk of those votes to neutral. And you understand math, right? You don't need to swing 30 votes your way. If you can swing 10 votes to be neutral, then you have to pick up 20 votes somewhere else. So that was an advantage, which I think the Russians are now, and the Chinese. I think that's part of this. I don't want to call it a tie-up, but this collaboration, I think, might be a better phrase, that the Chinese and the Russians are in. Is I think Africa represents a business model for them, where the Russians can do all the dirty work, and which the Chinese are just not very good at. I mean, I think it's been pretty clear. They kind of stumble their way through these things. They're actually in some ways too legalistic, and the Russians, well, don't worry about that as much. And the Chinese can get the economic benefits, and the Russians can collect the big. I mean, it's a mafia play, really. So the Russians can get a piece of the action, that they need. Maybe they need 10, 20% of those resources or some other deal there, and they can collect their 10% tax. And it's sort of a win-win for them. I think that's a big part of the Russian engagement there. And then now, especially given the financial sanctions, they kind of don't have a choice but to pivot to Asia, to use a term that was used in the West quite a bit. And I would say in their case, pivot to Africa, which I actually think will be fairly productive for the Russians because a lot of these states need support security assistance and military assistance, which the West has always been very reluctant to give them because of obviously human rights violations, plus, um, some of the history, some of the colonial history, et cetera. So, and the Russians don't really care about that. And the Russians don't have that history in the same way. And I'd say the last point is that when polled, um, so when you run polls about anything, generally speaking, the executive actors, if they poll high with elites, like a Putin, a country, then they don't poll as high with the general population or vice versa. Russians tend to poll high with both the population and the elites in Africa. So that's a powerful twofer that gives a lot of legitimacy to deal cutting, which the Chinese don't have, right? The Chinese don't poll anywhere near what the Russians poll in terms of that population. So, I think the Russians are, I mean, they're in it to win it when it comes to Africa. And this is going to be, I think, this century. This is going to be very difficult to change that policy by the local actors, which is going to constrain African growth quite a bit. Because these tend to be very extractive relationships and local relationships that are extractive, which is why I think Nigeria is going to just be a substantial beneficiary. Because if you're a productive actor in another country and you can't move 3 inches in 10 years, well, you go to Nigeria and voila, you're building projects, real estate. I mean, it just becomes another modern northern, global state, basically.
Yeah. All right.
Aaron, can I ask you one question? I apologize, Richard, to
Sure.
butt in. Sorry. So, growing up, you're particularly right that Russians or Soviets used Cuba as this proxy, I guess, the international core that would engage in Africa. And a lot of during and correct me if I'm wrong, Ethiopian Civil War, Cubans
Yep.
were involved as the special core.
They
during
were
the Israeli
everywhere.
They were,
They were
right, yeah. Do you think it has to do with Che Guevara's, teaching to go spread communism? What does
Sure.
that have to do?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the Cubans, hook, line, and sinker in the 40s and 50s, the Cuban revolutionaries, I should say, to be very specific, Marxist revolutionaries, they were more Stalinist, the Marxists than the Russians were. I mean, it's just pretty simple. The Russians have, there's a whole history. I mean, you can read the cables. The Russians rolling their eyes, or the Soviets rolling their eyes during the Cold War, especially the Khrushchev to the Brezhnev era, where the Cubans would have these, almost purity um, arguments with the Soviets. The Soviets at that point just could care less about, and there was a lot of, I'm not going to say conflict. There wasn't, violent conflict between the Soviets and the Cubans, but there was a lot of political challenges the Soviets had in trying to productively leverage Cubans as proxies, especially as the Cold War went on, because I think the Cubans were far more diehard. I would argue, especially when Mao, left the scene, that it's kind of absurd now to think of this, but it's not really. Castro should have had his picture right up there with all the Marxist greats at that point, because after Mao went, Castro was the next, quote unquote, great Marxist leader that was the history of that, right? Going back to Marx, Engels, Lenin, then Stalin, and then Mao, and so in many ways the Cubans viewed permanent revolution, and where there was any imperial or colonial vestiges, and there was very strong, this all ties back to the Soviet African cooperation and engagement and in education. And so you had a whole, 3 generations of African leaders from the 40s, I'd say from the late 30s and 40s through the 70s that were fairly sophisticatedly educated in Soviet ideology. Um, and then that shifted, right? It shifted to just normal education, technical education, et cetera, medicine, you name it. And obviously all that ideology is pretty much gone. I mean, it's hokey. I mean, there's a handful of kind of old left wing groups in that region, but it's pretty minimal.
Yeah.
The really what stepped into that void was Islamic radicalism in both a combination of nationalist Islamic radicalism and nationalist groups. So it's like a pretty explosive cocktail, and I would argue that that has been far more difficult and destructive than than the sort of Soviet Marxist internationalist cause, which was always going to appeal to more of an elite, anyways, because it's so damn complicated, right? If somebody says you got to read 30 books to really know what we're doing because you'll know the deep truth, well, most people aren't going to read 30 books, you know, and so that was always going to be a scalability issue, which proved to be right pretty much everywhere in the world. I mean, I'd say the Chinese
Yeah.
figured it out by smashing one red book into people as long as they could. So, but now you
But
see the
yeah,
most capitalist state in human history is in China. So I guess it's relative.
but no, we have one question, and it's sort of so the Soviets and the Russians were there for a while, and was that longer than the Americans, Canadians, um, and the French? And I would say that considering the longevity of the French colonial and post-colonial presence, um, and I would say that West Africa was certainly a competing ground ideologically. Um, the Americans and the French tended to act much more with military force than with cultural uh, engagement, whereas the Russians were much more interested, especially during the Soviet time, in cultural engagement rather than trying to expend military force. But the military force that they did expend was in other areas of the continent, like Angola
Yep.
or in Ethiopia. Um, so
And the way they supported groups, like
yeah,
the ANC, and there's a whole offshoot ecosystem of 50 different groups that were basically from the 50s, 60s, 70s were the dominant sort of communist Marxist groups, which almost all evolved into nationalist groups today, right? They almost all are very strong, dominant political party nationalist groups. So they've done really a sort of 180-degree turn in the last, really since the end of the Cold War. I
so
think there was
to
always an inevitability of that, actually.
yeah.
That's actually what I meant, Richard, by more successful. It seems like they were able to infiltrate the culture, whereas the Western influences seem to be more interested in
Surface level.
strategery, as some would say.
Yep.
Hmm.
No, that's a fair point. And I would say we can't underestimate the elite exchange and how substantial that's been in the last 60 plus years. I mean, you have, like I said, there's been millions of Africans that have been educated in the greater Soviet or if you include China now, which, or, let's say what used to be the world's Marxist sphere, let's say. So, the technical education and those links, back to China and to Russia have been very substantial because of that. And to the point that's language based, right? I mean, populations outside of, you know, the old Soviet sphere, the amount of people who speak Russian, when you look on a map, it's sort of shocking almost when you see how many people in Africa. I mean, it's not tens or hundreds of millions, but it's still millions of people in Africa that actually speak Russian. So, and those are people obviously went to school, in Russia. So I do think that's a really, big shift, basically.
So if we take up Aaron's sort of metaphor and pivot to Asia, one of the other major conflicts that's going on in the world today that there's not been a lot of attention focused on is Burma. And so you have this situation where in the 1960s, the Burmese military, the Tatmadaw, took control of the country, and starting in the 2010s with the Saffron Revolution and several other attempts at displacing the military conceded to create a quasi-democratic government. And that government was one in which there would be a legislature where half the individuals in the legislature were directly appointed by the military, half of them were elected by the people. And of course, in that election, Aung San Suu Kyi, the historic um, fighter for Burmese democratization against the military, took power. Now, during her period of, we can say, quasi-democratic rule from 2017 until around 2021, of course, the situation in Burma did not necessarily improve dramatically. And most famously, you had in the westernmost parts of Burma the genocide against the ethnic Rohingya population, which were a Muslim minority. You also had continuing from the pre Aung San Suu Kyi period into the democratic period, you had large scale extractive economic processes going on throughout the country, large scale child labor, low amounts of food penetration, degrees of sexual and non-sexual slavery throughout the country. Although there were some attempts by NGOs that were allowed a little bit more freedom to enter the country and move around to remediate those problems. That shifted in 2021 when the Tatmadaw decided that the degree of freedom that was increasingly going to be achieved by Aung San Suu Kyi and her liberal democratic movement, which was poised to win elections in a landslide in 2021, would serve to undercut their historic authority. And so they instituted a coup d'etat and tried to pacify the entire country, forcing the liberal democratic movement to sort of flee into exile because they didn't have a military or rebellion group of their own. However, there were a number of ethnic minority groups and politically disenfranchised groups that began to fight against the Tatmadaw in different areas of the country. And in 2023, in around April, they resolved to unify um, into into more or less one united force, primarily made of ethnic minorities fighting in the various regions of the country. The This unified group was initially unsuccessful, but starting in October, in what's called Operation 1027, because it was launched on the 27th of October, they were able to conquer significant amounts of territory from the Tatmadaw government. And you can sort of see on the map of Burma that light pink area that sort of covers everything from Yangon in the south through much of the Central Territory is controlled by the government. And anything that is not pink is controlled by one of the collage of rebel groups that are fighting either together or in parallel against the Tatmadaw. Often in a ideological or quasi-functional alliance with the liberal democratic movement, though most of them have not stated an explicit governmental policy other than that they want regional autonomy for insert ethnic group here. Um, in particular, of interest in terms of the way the conflict is going is that the groups operating in the Shan state, which is the state that borders China, you can see a number of different colors along the Chinese border. These groups have managed to recover a significant amount of territory, including many of the border posts with China. And the reason this matters is because China has been one of the major supporters of the Tatmadaw and their government. The benefit for China is direct access to the Indian Ocean without going through the choke point between Singapore and Sumatra called the Strait of Malacca. The Chinese are worried that if there were ever a conflict between China and the West, and so much of China's petroleum needs come through that choke point, that the United States, with its much more effective naval capabilities, could effectively starve China. However, if Burma is under Chinese control, it provides a direct land route into China from the Indian Ocean, circumventing that issue and making it much harder for China to be cut off. At the same time, especially the mountainous areas of Burma are host to a number of mineral resources that China finds very useful. So the combination of those things has meant that China has historically supported the Tatmadaw, but that could be changing because of the victories in Shan State. And to understand that, we have to understand a little bit about the pig butchering scams and how those affect Chinese people and why that would make a difference. So, the pig butchering scam is quite common in Asia, especially China. It's less common in the United States, but still exists. And what it is you have certain individuals, usually human traffickers, who manage to get large populations into forced factories where they are then given cell phones. And what they're told to do with those cell phones is to send messages to particular individuals and say that perhaps they, and you've probably seen text messages like these as well, saying, "Hi, my name is insert name here, and I think we met at this conference, or you looked really cute on your profile, or whatever. I'd like to talk to you." And when you tell them that they have the wrong number, they send you a picture of themselves. Of course, it's not a real picture of them, it's a picture of an attractive woman. In many cases, these these slaves who are forced to work in the butchering scams are men, but uh, they'll send pictures of women, and they're required under penalty of death to catfish these individuals and eventually pull money from them, right? Saying that, oh, I need money for this, I need money for that, until such point as they've extracted significant amounts of money from their victim, at which point they just let the victim go with really no money to survive on. Um, an act called butchering the pig, right? Because you've fattened it up, and then you take the money out. Um, this has been a specifically bad problem in China, and a lot of the traffickers are close to the Chinese border in Shan State. So the fact that these militias have managed to take control over this area and have begun sending China a number of individuals who had previously been operating pig butchering scams in that state and had been found guilty by the CCP in absentia, is beginning to warm the CCP towards these ethnic militias. And if that becomes the case, the military victories that these militias have seen in the latter part of 2023 could escalate to a full-blown collapse of the military authority in Burma. Comments, questions? Um, because of the fragmented nature
Oh,
of what
one
we see.
one
Oh,
quick
go ahead.
point. Yeah, is that I do think Burma becoming sort of a broken, fractured state, sort of a I would argue kind of an incompetent North Korea without nuclear weapons, is I think kind of critical to China deciding to step in or to, but that doesn't necessarily mean they support any Western interventions, right? They might just support their type of intervention. So I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't
I, I,
necessarily, and which is I think very important.
yeah, Chinese style intervention tends to be more fiscal than boots. Um, the other point, and I think it sort of goes to your fractured state model, is that because of the discontinuity now between different territories of within Burma, you have large scale food shortages throughout the country, starvation. Um, Hundreds of thousands of people have either fled their homes or tried to go to a different country, especially Thailand, to the extent possible, in order to avoid massacres, both by the Tatmadaw and by the ethnic militias. And we're seeing large-scale institutional collapse within Burmese systems that would rely on significant parts of the province that are no longer under their control. All right. there's a question of I can't grasp how the African prince or pig butchering scams can keep being profitable. African prince scams are very different from pig butchering scams in the emotional resonance of them. So, an African prince scam will be something like, "Hi, I'm an African prince. I need to get my money out of a bank. There's some strange fee that I can't pay for some reason, even though I have all this money. Can you pay me this fee?" And then I'll share the money with you. And of course, the person pays them the fee, and they never see them again. But there's no emotional connection other than, just help out a friend. Uh, and so it does have this aspect of gullibility, but it doesn't create an emotional connection, and it doesn't take the person for all they're worth, right? The pig butchering scam is particularly notable because one, these scams will go on for months, right? The the slave, I'll call them that, the slave who is texting the victim might cultivate a relationship over the course of a month, constantly telling them, "Hey, sunshine, I just woke up. Can you send me a picture? I'm sure you're really beautiful right now." All these kinds of things in order to facilitate um, an, uh, a pseudo relationship with this person, such that when they say, "Hey, look, I've come on hard times. I need $2,000, to just help my kid." Because they're not able to get into the school that they got into and they worked so hard. And I know that you really care about me because we've talked, all this time and so on. If only you could send me that $2,000, right? Um, and because of these relationships and because they've targeted individuals who really were looking for a connection, it's the gift that keeps on giving. And it's very hard, especially to convince populations in countries like China, where literally people have gone through the industrial revolution in their lives, right? You have elderly in China today who were born before they even knew what a factory was, and now live in a country that's a 21st century country. um, that's very disconcerting to a lot of them in the sense of they don't know what's real and they haven't been trained in order to understand the difference between a pseudo relationship and a real relationship. What does it mean to be in a long distance relationship? How do you deal with loneliness? Um, and it's very hard to educate these people on how to understand what's happening to them. So it's a very different operation. And I would further say that from a functional perspective on the deceiving side, it's also a very different organization in that with the African Prince scam, it's usually one person sends out an email, recovers the money. That's it. That maybe there's some degree of senior management, but to the extent that that exists, it's just to corral all these people in a boiler room. The pig butchering scam actually revolves around human trafficking. So it's not that the person who runs the facility, and it is a facility, it is a factory warehouse, where the slaves are chained to the floor. Um, this is an organized entity. It is a commercial entity with a end goal of extracting wealth and resources from individuals in other countries. And there was a further point that it's hard to believe that there are desperate, naive women. It's not just women. Men are also taken advantage of in significant numbers by these scams, and the majority of the slaves are men also. So um, it's about desperation and confusion and misunderstanding, and uh, like a lot of people create relationships online, and they never meet those people. What's the difference between those relationships um, and the relationships that are part of the pig butchering scam? There's a reason why it's successful. All right. So the last thing to touch on today is the conflict in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is an incredibly difficult place to understand, especially in the 20th century. Um, um, especially in the 20th century, because of the organization of the country itself. So, what we have to understand is that Ethiopia is an imperial state in much the same way that Russia is an imperial state or that China is an imperial state, in that it is a state that conquered significant amounts of territory that were historically separate from it and have a different language, culture, orientation from it. The beginning of the real Ethiopian imperial period starts with Menelik II in the latter part of the 19th century. He was coming from the Amhara ethnicity, and he controlled the areas where the Amhara and Tigray are the majority. And he expanded Ethiopia significantly further south, bringing into it the Oromo people, along with, to the west, a significant amount of Somalis in what's called the Ogaden region. He also brought in a number of areas to the southwest, which are a number of smaller tribes and ethnic groups that exist sort of in the periphery of Oromia. And by doing this, he created and consolidated, and the state would be further consolidated by his successors, including Haile Selassie. Um, into the functional state that it is. But we have to remember, though, that it was done as a project of an Amhara genetic line, and for the most part, during the rule of uh, the Empire of Ethiopia, as it was called at that time, the Amharas had a privileged position within the hierarchy of the country because they were the ones who functionally created it. And there's a functional problem with this, in that, as you can see from the percentage graph below, Amhara make up roughly a quarter of the population of the country. It's a very multi-ethnic country. Oromo are the largest ethnicity. You can see there in the green. Then the Amhara. Then in blue you have the Somali. In yellow you have the Tigray. And then you have a number of other smaller ethnicities like the Sidama or and other groups in the southwest of the country. So, because of this, you have fundamental struggle from the other groups within the Ethiopian space in order to achieve some sort of parity or equality against what was historically Amhara domination. One of the interesting aspects of Amhara leadership is, of course, in 1974, Haile Selassie gave permission to a certain group of military leaders to root out corruption within the country, and then they used that power to effectively put Haile Selassie in jail and take over the country. This military cadre was called the Derg and was led by a man named Mengistu. Uh, and Mengistu was aligned with the Soviet Union. As we sort of mentioned earlier, he turned Ethiopia into a nominally communist state. But even under this nominal communism, Mengistu and most of the officials within the Derg, there's between 100 and 120 such persons. It's debated by historians how many there actually were. These individuals were almost exclusively Amhara individuals as well. So when there became revolutions against this concentration of power, those revolutions came primarily from other ethnic groups. The foremost among them were the Tigray, with uh, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. You also had Amhara groups that were opposed to the Derg, either on ideological or on economic grounds. You had groups from the Oromo, which, of course, as we mentioned, is the largest ethnic group. And we had rebel groups coming from the Southwest, this panoply of different ethnic groups that all stood together. And the four of them together, the Tigray, the Amhara, the Oromo, and the Southwesterners, all came together in what was known by a functional alliance, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, which in 1991 effectively forced Mengistu out of the country, where he ended up in Zimbabwe, where he still stays now, despite being um, yeah, Zimbabwe, where he stays in exile now. The Zimbabweans are debating whether or not to extradite him to Ethiopia, where he has been found guilty of treason against the country in absentia. And many Derg members have been brought up for prosecution. Between 1991 and 1995, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front set out to create the new federal Ethiopian constitution, which is an entity that was designed understanding the multicultural dimension of the post empire Ethiopian space with these various different ethnic groups. And so it created these sort of conflicting federative values. For example, one part of the constitution argues that each ethnicity in Ethiopia is entitled to its own self government, up into including the possibility of secession. Whereas a different part of the Constitution says that the federal government shall have the power to maintain authority and control the actions within the subsequent uh, regional areas. As you can imagine, this naturally creates an incredible friction within the Ethiopian system as to whether it is truly federal, right? Something like the United States, where the states are in many ways beholden to the desires of the federal government, regardless of what they may wish. For example, states in the United States cannot secede of their own free will. And if a state governor were to somehow violate the national constitution of the United States, they could be forcibly compelled by the federal government to obey that law. Or if it's something confederal like Switzerland, where you have unification, but each canton has its own military requirements, has its own trade laws, and so on and so forth. Or if it's something like the European Union, where it's more an organization of entities underneath a larger umbrella. And the Constitution doesn't make clear, really, from a functional perspective, which one it is, given these sort of disparate permissions that were all incorporated into the Constitution. Now, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front remained the governing party of Ethiopia until 2019. But we should understand that even though this was a reflection of various different militaries from various different militant groups from different parts and different ethnic categories within Ethiopia, the dominant one among them was that Tigray People's Liberation Front. And so Tigrayans, despite being roughly 10%, roughly 6% of the total population in all of Ethiopia, were overrepresented in terms of the presidency under the republic, the layers in the military, governors in various different regions of the country, economic leadership. And under their leadership, there was an incredible amount of growth within the economic sphere of the economic sphere of Ethiopia. In fact, if we track from 1995 until 2015, over that 20-year period, you had roughly 9% economic growth year on year, which, to put it into context, the United States economic growth um, over the last 20 years is roughly 3%. 1.8 to 3% per year. So we have a massively growing economy within Ethiopia, and Ethiopia was beginning to assert itself as a power on the international stage, especially in its region of Africa. So we then move into the Tigrayan War. So part of the backstory that I didn't mention is that when there was the rebellion against Mengistu and the Derg, there was also a rebellion by the Eritreans, because Eritrea was historically a part of Ethiopia and part of the Ethiopian Empire. But unlike the four entities that joined together, the Tigrayans, the Amhara, the Oromo, and the southwestern ethnicities in their sort of unifying militia, the Eritreans decided that they wanted to just go their own way. And so they fought a war of independence, after which they were recognized as independent the uh, by the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. And after being recognized as independent by the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, um, you had a situation where the borders between Eritrea and Ethiopia were not solved. And you can see in the darker colors, both red and green, territories that both Eritrea and Ethiopia believed belonged to them. And so you had sort of those overlapping territories for which they fought what was called the Badame War, referring to that city in the larger green area, Badame, which became emblematic of the territories that the Eritreans claimed that Ethiopians were controlling and that the Ethiopians claimed were part of Ethiopia proper. Um, you had a war, a very strong hot war between 1998 and 2000 between Eritreans and the Ethiopians over this territory. As you can remember from the previous graph, from these previous pages, the territory of Badame was in Tigrayan claims, right? So the Tigrayans being the ruling group within Ethiopia during this period had a strong feeling about how to adjudicate this border situation. And so while the war was in its most extreme from 1998 to 2000, from 2000 until 2018, for nearly 20 years, the war kept going on at a lower level, resulting in a lot of economic dislocation and problems within the Ethiopian sphere. And of course, as I mentioned before, Eritrea had a mandatory draft and a large scale centralization of its authority into almost a North Korean level of dictatorship in order to continue the fight against the Ethiopians. Now, in 2018, there was a fundamental shift within Ethiopia as the first prime minister who was not Tigrayan became prime minister. And of course, that's Abiy Ahmed from the Oromo ethnicity, the largest single ethnicity within Ethiopia. And the Oromo didn't have a long-standing grievance with the Eritreans, and so Abiy Ahmed was willing to go to Algiers and discuss in front of international audiences how to best resolve the Badame situation. The Algiers Agreement in 2018 um, found that found that certain territories of the disputed region belonged to Ethiopia, but significantly more, including the city of Badame itself, belonged to Eritrea. And so those differences are reflected in the green and red colored regions on the picture there. So Abiy Ahmed actually received the Nobel Prize for being able to end this war with Eritrea and hopefully begin to reinstate peaceful relationship between the two countries. At the same time, though, he alienated many of the Tigrayans who felt that uh, they had been fighting to maintain control of their territory, that it was unlawfully ceded to the Eritreans. In fact, Tigrayan representatives were more or less disconnected with the ruling when it was finally passed down because Abiy Ahmed was not a member of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. In fact, he dissolved the organization more or less functionally in 2019, a year later. But what he had done is that he had withdrawn the Oromo from the Oromo groups from that coalition and brought with him the Amhara groups and the Southwestern groups, but not the Tigrayans. So the Tigrayans were increasingly ostracized from the system that they had helped build, both in terms of not being able to govern. They were effectively kicked out of the government when they lost elections and they weren't able to align with the other former members that they had held together. And furthermore, through this peace with Eritrea. So you have this creation by Ahmed of the Prosperity Party, which incorporated those other three members. And the Tigrayans became more and more concerned over the loss of power in their region and the eventual usurpation of their secessionist rights and their autonomy to the federal government that seemed like Abiy Ahmed was over going to do. And this came to a head in early 2020 when Abiy Ahmed argued that he was going to postpone the elections that would take place in the fall of 2020 due to an outbreak of a pandemic around the world. Now, the perspective among the Tigrayans is that the use of the pandemic was a cover for his actual intention, which was uh, to take away power from the Tigrayans and consolidate more of his own power. And so the Tigrayans actually, in defiance of the federal law banning the elections in 2020 and setting them in the future, they eventually did take place in 2021, but at that time, there was no future date set. Um, the Tigrayans held an election in protest on the 8th of September 2020, and you can actually see Tigrayans registering to vote in that picture in that election. In order to compel the Tigrayans to follow the rule of Addis Ababa, right, the capital of Ethiopia, under Abiy Ahmed. Ahmed sent soldiers closer to the territory, and the Tigrayans lashed out. So there began to be a war where the federal government began to make incursions into Tigray, and that war lasted until 2022, with numerous ebbs and flows in the war. In fact, the Tigrayans almost marched on Addis Ababa themselves, despite the capital city being hundreds of kilometers away from any territory where they have a majority. And the federal government also launched numerous wars throughout the different villages of Tigray. And to give a sense of how this war was just so confusing to everybody who was involved in it, I wanted to talk about the Maikadra massacre, which took place on the 9th of November. In this massacre, the majority of the victims were Amhara, um, but there were certainly Tigrayan victims. But different news organizations and different world organizations argue that the motivations and the attackers were different. So, for example, Amnesty International argues that this was an atrocity committed by Tigrayan military forces against an Amhara village, and the and other groups internationally argue that it was a massacre done by Amhara trying to target the Tigrayans, but killing a lot of Amhara anyway. So even in the aftermath of the conflict, we can't tell who was attacking who and for what region, or what reason, in which specific villages. All that we can tell is that there was a significant amount of death. In fact, the death toll in Tigray was roughly 600,000 by the time the war ended in 2022, which, to give perspective, is roughly the same size as the Syrian civil war over the totality of its 10-year time period. And the level of carnage wasn't strictly restricted to deaths, although there were many, because Ethiopia has one of the most modern militaries in all of Africa. Um, there was a significant amount of sexual violence used as an act of war. There were concentration camps where Tigrayans were concentrated in order to permit their liquidation. You have Amhara militants which entered the territory of West Tigray, and that's part of the precipitating part of modern Ethiopian conflict, where Amharans were ethnically cleansed from their territory. As you can see from the map in the lower right-hand side, there are significant numbers of IDPs, which are internally displaced persons, forced out of their homes and villages throughout Tigray, and many of them have become dislocated either within the territory of Tigray, within the territory of Ethiopia, or even further afield, leaving the country. And the federal government's behavior towards Tigray, even before the war, saw the precipitators of large-scale conflicts, such as cutting the budget that would go to Tigray, which would functionally starve the region. And in fact, significant amounts of starvation have occurred as entire fields have been burned. Similar kinds of activities to as occurred against the Darfuris in things like the Masalit massacre that we mentioned earlier. So finally, we get to the Amhara crisis. Finally, we get to the Amhara crisis, which is what's going on in Ethiopia right now, where the Amhara ethnic group, the one that had power during the imperial period and during the rule of the Derg, is trying to reassert itself in Amhara region. And they feel that despite having aligned with Abiy Ahmed in his war against Tigray, that they were not part of the peace negotiations, and the territories that they had conquered in Western Tigray, which should be theirs due to ethnic history, were given back to the Tigrayans against their consent. Another fundamental issue um, is that we're beginning to see Eritrean funding for the Amhara fighters. The Eritreans began to get involved in Ethiopian politics once again when Abiy Ahmed was fighting the Tigrayan war. Because when he was fighting that war, he needed Amhara militants and he needed the Eritrean military on his side to attack the Tigrayans, who were much better militarily organized. And so many Eritreans have still remained in the territory of Ethiopia. This is the picture on the upper right-hand side was actually taken by a hidden camera, because in many of these areas, especially along the Eritrean border, there is incredible amounts of surveillance, and the Eritreans don't want to make their presence visibly available. That said, um, the Amharans are seeking increased rights for themselves in their own territory, and they feel that the government under Abiy Ahmed is not responding to serious issues along their border, both the northern border with the Tigray, but also their southern border with the Oromo. Because Abiy Ahmed is Oromo himself, they think that he's giving a blind eye to the military expansion of the Oromo Liberation Army, which is seeking more and more power under the Ethiopian system. The conflict really started in April of 2023 when Girma Yeshitila, who was the federally appointed governor of Amhara, was assassinated by Amharans. And this has resulted in numerous small-scale massacres throughout the region. And while the government is able to control major cities, we have a lot of assassinations of police and governmental figures, and there is practically no control by the federal government of the countryside, which is controlled primarily by the Amhara Special Forces and by the Fano fighters, the former being a militant group that had much more training and arms, and the latter being a sort of local insurrectionist group. The war is intensifying as the Egyptian government uses its military power, both tanks and airplanes, which are far superior to anything that the Amhara can put together, in order to try and organize the territory. Questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think and this is part of why we did this, Richard, because we've discussed this for the last few months, is that arguably this is the most destructive conflict going on in the world the last 5 years, probably closer to 10 years, until the Ukrainian invasion from Russia, and this doesn't get much coverage anywhere. You'll see some on France 24, but most of that has even died down. So, I would argue we've grossly over-indexed around certain Middle East conflicts right now, and other sort of electoral conflict, which is nothing like this. And we are just completely unaware of what's going on, whether it's in Ethiopia, Eritrea, the Tigrayan War, because these are astronomically large conflicts which have had just huge displacement. Larger displacement, and I would argue to say about the same displacement and destruction that the Ukrainian-Russian war has
Yeah.
had so far. That's probably about, for being sort of numerically accurate. And this has received, I don't know,
Yeah,
0.001% of the media coverage, if it's even that much.
yeah. No, I mean, the population of Ethiopia is twice the population of Ukraine. I think that
That's right. That's right.
people seem to forget that it's 80 million
Yeah.
people.
And also, as you made a great point, I mean, Ethiopia has spent the better part of the last quarter century building an absolutely modern military. I mean, both at a command structure, technologically, training wise. I would argue pre-conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Ethiopia's military was, far superior to Ukraine's capabilities. So to have a force of this magnitude engaged, it also speaks to the impotence of both regional and global so-called superpowers, and of course the whole UN, whether a Security Council or General Council, they're just completely irrelevant, right? All these other actors are, and it's one of the challenges with this area is that there's pretty weak leverage points, um, for outside actors to
Right.
try to gain leverage on them, right? And it's one thing that Ethiopia has done, I think, a pretty masterful approach in the last 30 years as the Cold War ended, as globalization took off, as EU became EU, as the US sort of transformed from into more of a financial global trading country and so on. The Ethiopians have been very smart to never have any actor with too much leverage, or any leverage really for that matter, and including the
In their
Gulf
vicinity.
actors. Yeah, because the Gulf actors tend to be, let's just say, the lightest hand, and Ethiopia just doesn't even. I mean, they'll accept a little bit from everybody, right? They've got the world's biggest tapas banquet going on here, right? Where they'll take their little 0.25% from 75 actors. I mean, even the Japanese, which I think for those little period in the 2000s where they had more engagement, and the Ethiopians are really smart about this, right? They don't, it's not like Putin or, Western blowhards who just get on TV and start yelling at somebody. They just slowly, they do it the old fashioned way, right? They earn it as the commercial went, right? They basically move their delegation down slowly, and are you really going to send a protest? I mean, you're going to look like the fool if you do that, right? So it's a really effective way that they balance all the actors, but that gives them maximum, which really means they truly understand what they define as their interests, which is
Yeah.
the being a true East African regional superpower. And I think we have to see them that way, right? And I think it's hard for people to define that the modern world, and I truly believe this, we've talked about this before, is that we've moved into this world slash moving, where we've got about maybe 20 to 40 sub-regional to regional powers or wannabe powers that are flexing their interest in those regions, and they care a lot more about the hegemony in that region than any, we'll call it, legacy superpower does, whether it's China, Russia, the United States, and so on. And that gives them, incredible focus and flexibility. And I really believe, I mean, great example of that is Turkey right now, right? And I think Egypt is trying to figure that out themselves, right? And when you
Yeah.
look at that region, and I mean, the Gulf is interesting on that too, but in the end, they tend not to have much flex because they're so limited in what they engage with, which is basically energy politics, right? I mean, there's a little bit of financialization, but that's about it, really.
Yeah. No, I think one of
So
the interesting things about Ethiopia asserting itself in this way is, and I drew it sort of on the map so people can see, um, there historically in Somalia, there were three colonizers, right? There was the French, there was the British, and there were the Italians. Now, the French one became independent as Djibouti. British Somaliland, and Italian Somaliland came together to become the modern country of Somalia. But the British part broke off again in the 1990s and declared
yep,
independence as Somaliland. And despite being actually more organized and stable than pretty much any other country in the Horn of Africa, Somaliland has never been recognized internationally.
no,
But the Abiy government is actually considering recognizing them for the point of leasing their port, because as you can see,
yep,
Ethiopia is a landlocked country. And so Ethiopia could be the country that's sort of rewriting how the Horn of Africa is dealt with,
that's
the
right.
Somaliland situation. Um, this is the kind of thing that we really only see historically great powers doing. And I think that that sort of shows Ethiopia's ascendancy here.
Yeah, and it's sort of the point around how these super regional actors are gaining enormous or are exercising very focused power that's very targeted to their defined national interests, and I think how a place like Somalia which I believe has always been very fraught, obviously, but I think is, if there is a place that could get chopped up like Sudan is, it's Somalia next, right? Because there's such a
Yeah, there's
ethnic.
Somaliland, there's Puntland, there's
That's right.
there
There's
around
such an
Mogadishu.
Yeah. There's such an ethnic, a combination of ethno-religious divergence, independent of all of the we'll just call it misgovernance or lack of governance, and then independent of all of the sort of terrorist and rebel groups and so on. So it lends itself to this redefinition of the region, and I think that that might be an area that we could do even some more presentations on, is these when you look at a map around the world, I sort of pick, I kind of have major and minor regional actors, and I sort of added up a soft number of around 30 to 40 of these that sort of split evenly. As an example, obviously Saudi Arabia is I would say a major actor, but I think because of Dubai, you could say the Emirates is sort of a minor regional actor, right? Or maybe a tweener, right? And obviously states like Turkey, Israel, Egypt, and Ethiopia are major actors. And so, and when you look at, and I do think the reason this is important to understand is that these regional actors, in many ways, condition and confine and constrain what the global actors can actually engage. A good example of this is Uzbekistan, right? I don't think most people, think twice about Uzbekistan, but as a regional actor, right? They flex pretty smart, given the tough neighborhood they're in between Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Russia, China, the rest of the stans, Afghanistan, etc. You know, they carve out their own independent, policy, that if any actor tries to skip over them, they tend to get tripped up on a speed bump. Um,
Yeah.
and and to me, that's sort of this framework, right? How much of a minor versus major actor you are is how can you generate costs to others that want to implement policy, right? The U.S. would never, and NATO was never going to be able to sustain operations in Afghanistan without Uzbekistan. That
Right.
and the ability to create modern air bases and basically just modern logistics centers, like basically their own, uh, what do you call it, Ramstein Air Base, circa, Uzbekistan, right? And the Russians too, right? Let's not forget that, right? I mean, it's going back, really through the Cold War. So to me, a place like Ethiopia and all of East Africa is getting its history rewritten,
Yeah.
and it's being rewritten by Africans. And the world outside really has, I would say, zero impact on that. And the
I
African states,
no, I was going to say
go ahead.
the age of large international countries having, exclusive control in sort of this bipolar or unipolar world is
That's right.
quickly ebbing away. We have a question
I,
of we have a question actually to sort of pivot. Why can't Russia be chopped up? Um, I think there's a lot of fanciful sort of stuff on the internet
yes.
about, for
Nobody
example,
wants Russia chopped up. That's the first reason.
I was
Forget
gonna say
about
like
inside Russia or outside of Russia. It's just
uh,
not. There's no market demand for Russia chopped up, except from a
yeah.
tiny percentage of
So
nihilists
Uh,
that think.
why is that? I mean, I hear
well,
this.
okay. Let's go through
Okay,
this.
let's play this out. All
There
right.
are several ethnic republics in Russia. If we remove the ethnic republics where the ethnic republic is a name and the population there is less than 20%, right? For example, Birobidzhan is the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. Jews make up less than 1% of the population of Birobidzhan. You have Udmurtia, where Udmurts make up, I think, something like 15% of the population. If you remove these sort of groups, the territory of Russia that is occupied by these minorities is almost all concentrated in the North Caucasus, and it makes up less
That's
than
right.
3% of Russia's total area.
Hmm.
The one exception to this is Sakha, which is so physically isolated um, that if it became independent, it would be bordered entirely by Russia and the Arctic Ocean. So there's no functionality for that kind of a state. Then the next level is that in nearly every Russian territory, there's at least 70% Russian ethnic Slavic population. So
That's
once
right.
you've excluded those ones like Dagestan, that's like 98 Dagestani, or Ingushetia, or
Yeah.
Kabardino-Balkaria, or Kalmykia, or uh, Buryatia or Tuva, where the Russian population is very small. Once you've excluded, that 3% territory, um, it's almost 70% ethnic Slav everywhere. So what are you
Yeah,
going to do?
and we can't look at this as a bug. It's a feature of Russian software, right? Like, and I look at it this as like this is Russian software, right? So they
Yeah,
wrote software that guaranteed that they have a dominant, 70% plus population, and the let's just say the territorial rewriting of boundary history that the Russians have evolved is such that there's rarely, um, statelets or republics, or governorates that are cleanly contiguous topographically, where they
yeah,
could, be independent operating wise. And once again, that's Russian software. That's not a bug. That's a feature.
right. And
The
the
other
other
thing,
point. Oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead, please. Yeah, go ahead.
I was
Yeah,
going to
then
say
the
the other
last
thing is
point. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, with the exception of the ones in the North Caucasus, like if we talk about Chuvasha or Tatarstan or
Yeah,
Bashkortostan or these kinds of areas, if they were to become independent, they would be entirely circumscribed by Russia. They would be the
that's right.
Lesutos and Vatican cities of Russia.
That's
Um,
right.
so what? They're going to be
The other
independent and then
point,
subject to an economic blockade? Go ahead.
the other point is, a lot of people don't like to, think of worst case scenario modeling, right? They only like to think right now is the worst moment in human history, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. Um, there's a worse world. The worst world is 30 Afghanistans in Russia. That's a worse world than this Russia. However bad this Russia can be towards Ukraine, towards other people, towards Georgians, I totally agree. But it can always be a lot worse. And a a Russia that's eating itself, that won't accept being eaten by itself. I mean, I don't know any state that would be, it's probably the largest, cataclysmic civil war in history.
I mean, we had that
As
experiment.
exactly, we had that experiment, and by the way, that experiment was kind of limited to Western Russia. Most people don't fully appreciate that once that occurred, it basically is just a great big ethnic cleansing project for 30
I was
years
going to say, by the way, for
after
those of you
that.
who don't know what we're referring to the Russian Civil War, which occurred from 1917 to 1924.
That's right, and that was mostly a Western Russian slash cleanup in other regions, but then a 30-year ethnic cleansing project at the same time,
Yes.
and forced migration project of tens of millions. So you know, imagine that happening countrywide, and this across Eurasia. So you've got actors that are substantially different, right? I mean, China's response to this is
I
they
mean,
have
China's
a
response would be annexation.
annexation because they have a territorial view, which has some foundation in history, like every other one does generally, but is not very pragmatic in a de jure 2024 world. That there's a whole chunk of Eastern Russia that's basically Chinese and Han, even though they weren't Han people, but whatever, they're Han people because
Yeah, because
everywhere's
we all know
Han.
that Evanger
Um,
Han.
exactly, everyone's Han, right? It doesn't matter where you are. Ethiopian Hans, right? That's where we're next, right?
But
No, but
but
we have
Aaron and Rich, just my argument, and hear me out for a
Yeah,
second. And I
sure.
think
yeah,
there's definitely somebody who doesn't want to, disintegrate. I agree with you, but here's an issue. Soviet
yeah,
Union, right? Like they used to
sure.
implement or infiltrate, like my city, Tashkent, Uzbekistan, nothing to do with Russia, but we were
Yeah.
70% Russian Orthodox
Hmm.
in Tashkent. 3 million
Of
people,
course.
2 million
Yeah,
people are Russian. Like we're
That
yeah.
not
was the
And
talking
what was
about
software.
and what was
Jewish,
the
nothing.
population? And what was the population of Uzbekistan in percentage
20,
of Russians?
25 million. But hear me out. There's the Tajiks, there's Iranian, there's
Yeah,
Turks.
yeah, yeah. Of
I mean,
Right.
course.
mostly
No.
Uzbeks, obviously, but obviously it's mostly Uzbek. But they lived in rural areas. Major
Yeah, yeah,
cities
yeah.
were either Tajik
Sure.
or Russian. So, like, Hiva, the Samarkand. Samarkand is fully, the major language was Tajik.
Yeah,
Yes.
Bukhara,
Sure.
major
sure.
language.
Sure. But even
Bukhara
before,
language, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
sure. But before Russian imperialism in Central Asia, the relationship between the Tajiks and the Turkic peoples was actually pretty consistent, with Tajiks in the major cities and the Turks in the
Yeah,
rural areas. And so, if there were to be an independent Uzbekistan, it would look very similar, at least in the eyes of most people. Before, like, imagine Russian imperialism never happened, right? The
yeah.
modern countries of Khiva and Khokhand and would have still been Tajik cities with rural populations that were Turkic, and that would be in that sort of symbiotic relationship. So I don't think that people of Uzbekistan are worried about Tajiks being in opposition to the viability of an Uzbek state, because an Uzbek state would have required Tajiks to be viable.
That's right. That's
It
exactly
doesn't
right.
require Russians to be viable. And in fact, Russians didn't settle much further south in the middle half of Kazakhstan, except for major cities. That's very different from a place like Buryatia, which is 65% Russian throughout the territory. Or it's very different from Chuvashia, which is something like 70 to 80% Russian throughout the territory. And the
Okay, what
Chuvash
about the
people are mixed.
independent state prior to Russians conquering during the Second World War? The one you were giving presentation on. What's his name? The three independent states after the Civil War, they became next to Buryatia. You know which one I'm talking about? Forget.
No, the one I
This
talked about was Buryatia. You're talking about Tuva?
Tuvok. Yes, correct. Sorry.
Yeah, Tuva was independent for a few years before it got re-annexed.
Yeah, because I mean, we don't want to play this game, guys, because there is my favorite homeboys that if they push the button, not that they could, but if they did, they could claim Eurasia, i.e., the Mongols, right? So, in the end, the the structure that we have post Cold War, which is the most stable outside of these incredible conflicts in East Africa and in Ukraine and Russia. I mean, it's the least amount of conflict that human beings have ever had in this nation state structure, and we
Right.
can have our 12,000 reasons why it's wrong,
So
but if
what
you
I'm
look
leaning
at the
toward,
data,
Aaron and
yeah,
Rich, what I'm
yeah,
leaning toward is I think China and United States they kind of have a role in the world, and now Russia has a role in the world. It's almost like they play this chess that's kind of in general agreement. You'll be a bit bad guy for a little bit, and we're kind of going to be on the side. So there's an interest for them not to disintegrate Russia. That's interesting, but I think we're not seeing in the big picture, right? Now, Trump administration, for argument's sake, may or may not become, what it become now. The whole aspect changes. All of a sudden now Russia becomes a good guy. Like it's just
yeah,
it's
but
almost
it
like
doesn't. It doesn't. But here's the thing, Zach. I mean, I
Okay, go ahead.
think I think people get too essentialistic about the physics, like the actual physics, the human physics, the scale. We're talking about billions of human beings. That whatever someone says in a nice fancy hotel, in a conference room, or on PowerPoint or on TV does not translate like real world, like gun in the hand real world, right? In the end, I mean, you see how challenging it is for Russia, where Russia's taken about 108 square miles in 2 years, coming up, I think, in a few days, right? And so, it's at the end of the day, um, the reality about changing any of these borderlands or of these border regions is just not realistic. And if anything, the world realizes that basically when you get one of these malevolent actors, especially if it's a cult of personality or um, a personality state, which is basically what Putin has, and I think Trump would like, and what she has, and 50 others would like. Um, that the general interpretation is you just have to endure because these people aren't. It's not a sci-fi movie. They don't live forever. Right? They live, however long they live. They usually get replaced by like a rump leader, some general, you know, general half-ass X, whatever, who lasts, if they're lucky, 3 years, five probably at the out. And then it tends to, you tend to get an equilibrium again. Well, not like it's good guy land and everybody
No,
in
no, no. I understand,
Singapore,
but I
No,
what
but
I'm trying to
no,
but
wait,
say.
wait, 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 and I also want to respond to this because there's a lot of
you know,
points that you brought up, Zach, which are really important to address. I think the first one is this idea of, okay, if we gave all these states independence, what is the functional outgrowth of that? Because the Russian organization, if we want to call it that, the set of generals that are operating in Putin's cadre in Moscow, they're going to see this as a direct attack on the Russian heartland.
that's
So there's
right.
going to be a war. And in order to prosecute that war, you're going to need some kind of militant group to achieve the independence or quasi-independence of these states. And we know what that looks like because we saw Chechnya in the
That's right.
1990s do exactly this routine. And how did Putin solve the problem of Chechnya? By creating what is effectively a complete autonomous state within a state that's a Muslim theocracy
That's
run
right.
by a military clan called the Kadyrovs. Like
That's right. It was basically a mafia. It's just a mafia, basically.
so or you have the situation that we saw with Armenia, right, where it basically became a Russian client state for 30 years. Um, or you have the situation of Kazakhstan, where Russia has incredible political control and literally put down a riot against Tokayev in early 2022. So you have a situation where you're going to need some buy-in from some military leader who's going to operate in that province that territory and then their wishes and their desires become part of the process. And so assuming that everything goes as well as it did in Chechnya, which I think is a really low bar, but assuming that things go as well as they do in Chechnya, that's a massive civil conflagration. And if it's actual independence for all the different regions of Russia, then you have a massive civil war.
That's
And
right.
so the ideologies of the individuals who may, if you have a Bashkir nationalist who basically says, the Bashkirs are being drafted at higher than Slavic numbers in order for the war in Ukraine. Completely true. That the Bashkirs are suffering greater unemployment than Slavic Russians. Absolutely true. That Bashkirs should rule themselves in order to give themselves the effective means, and I would say within an autonomous structure, totally on board. My issue would fundamentally be that if we're going to talk about independence, we need to talk about military activities, and military activities are so incredibly disruptive, um, and they will turn the values that are underlining the original argument on its head, and create life significantly worse because Bashkirs will be definitely more enrolled in a military that's done to defend their own interests than in any Russian military. And two, you're not going to have economic prosperity if you're trying to fight your borders. In fact, if you look at any of the Bashkir proposals, and I'm picking on the Bashkirs because it's easier than going through every single example, um, they don't have they're trying to fight also for a Slavic majority region that would connect them territorially with Kazakhstan, so they wouldn't be completely landlocked by Russia. Um, and that's not even a good sell, right? So like you have problems from a pragmatic perspective at every point in the independence discussion. Never mind how destabilizing that is for the rest of the populations in the region. So I think it's a fun idea to debate at cocktail parties, and then you realize that actually applying it would be a disaster. What would what I would propose, and I don't think Aaron would disagree with me here, but I'm open to hearing it, is a certain degree of actual federalization in the Russian space, where you redesign the territories of Russia with regard to ethnic and social contexts. And then you give those areas a significant degree of internal control, something closer to a Switzerland type system, where you have cantons that actually have autonomy and can make laws that respect the local localities and create sort of a buy-in from the local populations, as opposed to a Moscow first style of imperial rule that Russia functionally has. Uh,
I personally think, this is generally my opinion, is that the only person that I was able to rule the West and trick the West and use the West was Stalin. Right now, Putin thinks he plays this game, but I think he's just playing. He's playing a minor game in this total global war. Somebody's using him for his, for their own benefit, and it was. And in my respects, I think the administration changes, the sentiment would change, and that's the issue. And the only person that was truly independent, obviously being a terrible person, was Stalin. He used the West for lend lease and said thank you, no thank you.
Well, I mean,
that's a very different issue.
yeah, that's a different issue, and I would argue that could be that might have been true, but the Western interests, which was to prosecute the war against Germany, overrode the risks that that the West saw in allowing the Germans to have complete domination across, well, at least Western Eurasia. And so I think that was the trade-off that can be once again debated in cocktail circles. But I mean, in the end, it's a broader question of when you're dealing with this real world physics of these actors, you have to look at what the larger risk is and the knock on risk, right? The knock on risk. I mean, look at what the conflict in Ukraine has done for migrations, right? I mean, everybody's talked about how large the migration out of the Middle East was from the Syrian conflict and ISIS in Iraq and Syria in the early 2010s, which was somewhere in the order of
Five
maybe
million
5
people.
million people. Yeah, of which a big chunk ended up in Turkey, really, for being objective. Or maybe if we include Turkey, it's 8, and Turkey got about half. Um, but Ukraine had that many people in 9 weeks, move. And let's be real, that conflict, as horrible as it was or is highly contained on the Eastern Front, right? And right bank, left bank, right? So, if you're looking at a Russian conflict that would be, all over the place, I mean, you'd be looking at tens of millions of Russians moving. I mean, it's just the migratory impact would be astronomical, which would, the security, the financial systems. I mean, look at it this way. I mean, like, let's be really, really brutal about it, like truthful. I mean, the Russians, which are part of the sort of OPEC plus world, right? If you took, and I think it's pretty realistic, if you model these type of conflicts, you would take at least half, if not three quarters, it's probably more realistic to make it more like 70-80% of the production offline, which would just basically detonate the energy markets. So something like that would throw the world into a very deep recession, and with no end in sight. So the world, so this wonderful freedom play, the world would turn around and say, give me a bucket of Russian generals and let's just cycle through them until we get one that just glues it back together, right? So we would just end up at the same place with a huge amount of loss between, when we started. And I think this is what people have to be willing to be honest about, is this is the real politic, right? I mean, we lost Kissinger. in the last few months, and and Brzezinski in the last I guess what 6 years. These kind of these heavy hitters who everybody hated because they could sell they'd sell their mother down the road because their view of Hobbesian national interests and stability and security in the system was and is a pariah. And I don't think, excuse me, the world has become so post Hobbesian. Or let's put it this way: we don't have enough consistent signals that show us that we're post Hobbesian on a regular enough basis for any of these type of experiments to ever be allowed, right? And I think Russia is very unique in its scale. It's not. It has a Russian identity, very linguistically, and then it has its software, as Richard was saying. The dominant, Slavic Russian regions. But at the same time, it has its territoriality, right? And since Catherine the Great, which I think, whatever you want to say, 90 some percent of what we call Russia today, is basically the Catherine the Great software.
Yeah.
The idea of changing that map in any meaningful way. And by the way, I don't see a lot of when I was talking earlier about all those regional powers or this super regionalization. I don't see a lot of those regional actors wanting to play ball with this either because they have their own version of being a mini Russia in their own backyard, right? And you cascade down this sort of no man's land, down the tunnel, and you end up in a chaos world, in a world of
Yeah.
3, 5, 600 years ago, and
Yeah.
one last quick point on Russia, which I do think is important, as Richard's been bringing up, is that Russia has had this has gone through these bouts of innovation around its state design, within the state, right? How many governors they have, the degree of diffusion, how state strong they are at the local level versus not. I do believe in a post-Putin Russia that really takes off, actually, primarily because of modern life and technology, smartphones and everything else that we have, right? It just
It
forces
collapses
that.
distance.
It collapses distance. You can't wait for Moscow to decide when to add the next 20 kilometers onto your road project, right? It doesn't make sense.
I mean, never
Um,
mind the fact that significant parts of Siberia you can't even make roads because of the permafrost. So
that's right.
it just there's so many massive infrastructure challenges that aren't even just
That's right.
Russia specific in the sense of like Russians can't deal with them. Americans couldn't deal with them if they had the
No,
same
of course not. Well, we
geography.
don't because look at our limits in Alaska at this point,
Yeah.
right? So we have limits in Alaska on what we can do and not do. So I think so this whole argument, I do think it's a great thing to conceptually debate because there will be a post-Putin Russia, and at some point, whether it's 10 years or 20, I'm pretty confident in 20, not as confident in 10. There's something about and Putin seems very Howard Hughesy when it comes to some of his own health, safety, behavior, things he eats. And I think a chunk of those guys tend to last quite a long time. And I think I'm trying to remember. Is he 69? I think he's 69 right now.
Yeah.
Um,
But
yeah.
anyway, I
So
think I think we should close this out.
yeah.
So any last questions before we do, or are we good to go?
Yeah, I
Because
think this is
cause,
pretty
no,
good.
no, because I think you and I, as I said, would agree that post-Putin Russia, if it really wants to be successful, needs to find some sort of confederal way to
Right.
reintegrate the minority ethnic experience into
Yep.
the Russian national experience, right? And create a clear division between Russian as in a Slavic ethnicity and Russian as in a national of this country. Um,
Well, and that's going to be a challenge for Russia for one simple reason is that this transformation of let's just call it modern, um, more homogeneous Islam. It's more unified, right? It has they have more almost Catholic vibes, right, in terms of how it's amplified out versus the sub-regional um, sects that used to be very dominant, and there really was no market to sort of push from the Shia arc or from or whether it's the modern Wahhabis or this idea that you would even that anyone would even care about what the Egyptian Sunnis were thinking. It just didn't. It's just sort of irrelevant. And so I do think that's a challenge for all of southern Russia over time, because those populations, if they don't have a substantial education mandate, especially for women, then you tend to have some pretty regressive um,
Ideas that take hold.
evolution there. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I do think that's one thing Russia has as a big advantage is they've always maintained a pretty stringent definition on some state requirements. So to go to high school, to get to just and it was fairly egalitarian, right, in
Yeah.
relative terms. And so I think that's a big advantage that Russia has over many places in the world that run the risk of deconstructing
I
or
mean, I was gonna say
that the
we've seen it in
state.
Uzbekistan and in
Yeah,
Tajikistan. Yeah.
that's right. And because Russia's always had a first, second, third class citizenship, but I do think those are getting tighter. I mean, maybe not the first, the top of the first, the elite first is what it is, but let's call it the lower part of the first through the top of the third class citizenship. That's getting compressed as opportunities, as uh, as as economic development exists, as education exists, and I do think that's probably Russia's biggest advantage long term. And if they ever get it, not even together, if they ever just stop doing fairly ridiculous things, their opportunity to develop is is astronomical, especially in basic things. So we're talking logistics, infrastructure, financialization. I mean, just the nuts and bolts stuff. Just executing Plan Brazil gets them to double their economy.
Yeah.
All right. Forget about anything in a more advanced European way or some combined way with China. I do think this will be an interesting test the next 5, 10 years because they're spending a lot more time and energy with the Chinese, and how much of that transmission comes back to the Russian economy, right? Do you see more large scale projects? Do you see um, more modernization that you would expect to see spending time with the great modernizers. And to me, that's going to be the interesting test over the next 5, 10 years, because the Chinese, it's a market for China and it's a demand for Russia. And the question is, can can
There are
Russia
already more Chinese
execute?
living in certain areas of southeastern Russia than there are Russians there.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And if you look at some industries like timber, where it's very much like industries all over the world, right? Everyday young Russian men don't want to go into the great timber industry, right? They'd rather go live in Moscow, St. Pete, or 50 other places and, whatever, work in a call center, than, get up at 4 in the morning and, whack trees around. So, you're seeing some of those industries are completely dominated by basically Chinese migrant workers, and they're starting to intermarry. I mean, they have already, but that's scaling, especially with the Asian female crisis that exists,
Yeah.
where there's hundreds of millions of more men than there are women across
And Russia has a
most of
slight
Asia.
excess of women. Yeah.
Exactly. And in those regions, if whatever reason you're a female and you're still there, I think I think it's Match.com Russian timber industry style. And and I think that's the kind of evolution that's going to be interesting to see how Russia develops with China. And I really do think this Chinese Russian economic development is real long term. I don't believe in the strategic
Political
one at
space.
all.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I definitely believe in the economic one. The economic one, given the options Russia has, and also the options China has, and both of their demands and needs that they have. Right, Russia has to modernize, and this is going to cost you know tens of trillions of rubles to do the stuff they needed to do the last 30 to 40 years. They need to do that the next 20 years. Airports, trains, logistics hubs, all this stuff. Right. And that's independent of the war of Ukraine. I mean, even if they didn't have the war in Ukraine, that they would have to have done this anyways. And I think in some ways, the war in Ukraine is forcing their issue to become more strategic with China economically, where they, in some ways, were misallocating economic resources towards Europe, luxury goods, a whole bunch of things that was never going to help Russia modernize,
Yeah.
not in any realistic way. It was only going to help Western Russia modernize. And if anything, back to the last point around these ethnic populations and all the statelets, the China tie up for Russia is the likely path because of its direction geographically for a more of a more practical economic development for Russia that brings those populations together.
Great.
Because those populations are likely to not want to, disrupt the apple cart. If they're getting state security from Russia, they're getting economic opportunity from China, and they're actors, let's say, and they're commingled in their own ethnic existence, and nobody's giving them any problems with it, right? I mean, they're not out
Yeah.
there marching for people in Jezing or anywhere else. So,
All right. I think on that
yep,
note, um, thank you everybody for coming. My East Asia series is starting on March 7th. That's a Thursday night.
very
Um,
exciting.
at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Sorry for you UK people. Might be difficult for you to come. Um, and yes, it'll be an episode where we sort of talk about the cultural underpinnings of East Asia before we start to move into the last 2,000 years of Asian history, right? We're going to start with in the subsequent weeks with the Qin and the Han, and what does it mean to be in sort of the East Asian co-prosperity sphere,
And I'm
as
really
the
looking
Chinese
forward
constructed
to
it.
the series on all the successful Chinese invasions of Vietnam over the last 2,000 years. That's going to be a
Yeah,
really exciting uh, series as we go through that too.
yeah. So anyway, thank you everybody for coming, and of course, check out all of our offerings at on YouTube.